Welcome back to another episode of Titans of Foodservice. I'm your host, Nick Portillo, and today I have a real treat for you as I sit down with Taylor Crown, who's not only made a name for himself in the food service industry, but has done so in multiple dimensions. Taylor's story is as remarkable as it is inspiring. His journey into the world of food service began working alongside his father in their family-owned food service brokerage, Buzz Crown Enterprises. Together, they navigated the intricacies of the industry, building a wealth of experience and knowledge along the way. But that's just the appetizer. In my conversation with Taylor, we delved into the main course of his career, the remarkable ascent that led him to become the President of Acosta Foodservice, one of the nation's largest food service brokerages. We'll explore the lessons he's learned, the challenges he's overcome, and the savory successes he's achieved throughout his journey. So sit back and prepare your taste buds for a delectable discussion as we uncover the secret behind Taylor Crown's remarkable career in the food service industry. It's a journey seasoned with passion, hard work, and a dash of entrepreneurship, and you won't want to miss a single bite of it. Let's go ahead and welcome Taylor. Taylor, welcome to the Titans of Foodservice podcast. I appreciate you taking time today to come on and share your story. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Nick, for having me.
Of course. I'm curious, where are you based out of?
So I live in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
I'm on site at a client today in Texas, but okay.
Nice. Do you travel around quite a bit?
I do.
Yeah. All over the country. Is there like a favorite market that you love to go to?
Is there a favorite market? Well, I mean, I think you have to say Chicago is probably my favorite place to visit for a variety of reasons. And I think it holds kind of a special place for our industry from the restaurant show and other various reasons. But primarily for the last year or so, I've been coming to Texas and back.
I like that. And being in North Carolina, are you a UNC guy?
Well, that's a great question. I have a son who's a freshman at Clemson.
Okay, nice.
I went to graduate school at Wake Forest, and my wife is a Hokie, so we kind of have the ACC thing going on, but it's kind of a unique thing, especially within a conference, to change loyalty. So we've become Clemson Tiger fans.
Yeah. How are they doing this year? I think they're a couple losses.
Yeah, they had an unusually shaky start, but I think overall they have a phenomenal program, and we're lucky enough to go to a game with our son for Parents Weekend, and then he has season tickets. But it's 80-some thousand fans. It's an incredible experience. I started my food service career. In fact, most of it was in a little north in the Mid-Atlantic, so in Virginia.
Okay.
In the Maryland area, but we've just kind of moved a little bit south and a little bit south.
Nice. How did you get into the food service industry?
Well, great question. Like you, I am a second generation food broker and more broadly kind of food service. And I would say in a very really literal sense, my earliest memories involve food service. So when I was a kid, my dad worked for a variety of manufacturers, including Sara Lee, which I mentioned because a few decades later, I also worked for Sara Lee in basically the same role and basically the same market. Is kind of a neat thing, at least for he and I. I don't know if it was for anybody else, but that was kind of neat. And then he went to work, started a food broker, and ultimately sold that, which is now part of one of the nationals, and went to work for a large distributor out of Eastern Maryland, and we did that for a while. Then he went to work for another food broker, in which he ended up owning, and then he and I ended up becoming partners in down in Virginia. So we moved to Virginia, but I started working for him in between freshman and sophomore years in college to kind of make money to pay for then the next year, with a select group of manufacturers, and just literally going door to door on the street. And a few years later, when I graduated, I would say somewhat unplanned, like it just kind of worked out that way, and started at that point immediately after graduation, and have done it ever since.
Wow.
Yeah.
So food service, you can maybe say, is in your blood.
Yeah, no, it is for sure. My brother's a DSR with Benny Keith and the North Florida market. My closest friends throughout my whole life have been either in the industry in one part or another, whether it's distribution, broker, manufacturer, et cetera. So yeah, definitely in the blood.
I'm curious, when you were in college, did you expect to get back into the food service industry or to be in the food service industry?
I didn't. I'm not sure I thought about it all that much,
Yeah.
to be honest, right? In that sense. And for me, I think I mean that kind of in a couple different directions. One is I'm not sure I thought as much about what a career would mean and what that kind of career journey would look like. I think, at least for me, I think that's something that's talked about. Like I talk to my kids about that, and I think it's just sort of part of the overall kind of cultural conversation, right? In the sense that kids might have as heroes today in high school or in college, people that started companies or Amazon or Elon Musk or whoever it is, in ways that I think wasn't as much as part of kind of the culture when I was that age. So no, I don't think I thought about it as much. Certainly coming out of it, it felt natural. I don't know that I was really all that good at it at first, but sort of worked into it. And yeah.
Here you are. I was the same. When I was going through college, getting my degree in business, I was a little lost in terms of what I wanted to do. I think there's a lot of pressure of, what's the next step after you're done with school. And by the time you graduate college, what grade is that? That's like, you go through K through 12 and then you get 4 more years of college. Like I've only ever done school, so I know school. And then coming out of that, like, what is next? I interviewed for some financial advisor companies, and I was going through that process. And then my dad approached me about starting a business together, and definitely apprehensive at first. But then as we kind of got into it, it was a special bond that him and I started to build. We always had a great father-son connection, but then having that business partner connection, which was a new frontier for us. And looking back now over my 8 years I've been doing this, it's an experience that I can keep forever, and it's very near and dear to my heart, and it's special for sure. And I'm glad I've been able to do that here in the food service industry.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you shared that with me. And I would say for me, it would be almost literally the same exact thing as you can imagine, right? We had a number of a long time together, probably at least a decade and a half or so. I'd have to count to see if I was plus or minus a decade and a half.
Yeah.
Everything that goes with that, right? From kind of the triumphs of gaining a new client and kind of hearing that they decided to hire you for the market, to the feeling of losing a client, or and kind of everything in between, from figuring out how to operate the business and how to make it better and how to differentiate and compete. And then a lot of the real kind of memorial stuff, going to the National Restaurant Show together, going to broker conferences and so forth together is really something. And really to this day, we still share it, although he's retired. And as I mentioned, youngest brother is in the industry as well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's been I think that I guess would be true if he happened to, own a Radio Shack franchise or something like that. But I think it's unique and memorable that it's in our industry.
Yeah, totally. What would you say was the dynamic between you and your dad? What was that like?
Well, I always joke. I can't remember if this is true for you and John or not, but for Dad and I always joke that we had offices a few hours apart, which helped.
Oh, nice.
But in all seriousness, honestly, it really was was always great and very natural, right? I mean, there's sort of something about being partners that is different, or being partners, being working together, I think maybe beyond just that particular word, that is different in a lot of ways than the other father-son type of relationship, or family relationship, if you will.
Right.
And again, for all those sort of memorable times, highs and lows, like we just sort of described, by the way, times thousands of different variations and permutations. There is a kind of an intellectual and an emotional intensity about it that I think is particularly unique when it's a family member. I would also say, incidentally, also something that I would say that we shared, which is that he really, was a very big figure in the industry, and also very good at it, right? So sort of learning about what that meant, so for years, I mean, literally years, maybe decades. So I don't want to scare you to so you'll think in your mind, well, you still have years to go. I would have been known as his son, right? Or his kid, even to some degree up to this day, probably less so, but still occurs.
Yeah, for sure. One thing that has been nice as the son of, someone who built his career in food service is he did a lot of some of the heavy lifting for me, building relationships and things like that. So that when I came into the business, they're like, "Oh, I know you, Nick," and your dad used to talk about you. You're the baseball guy, and so it was kind of nice to always be able to lean back somewhat on his experience and his relationships in the industry.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. That resonates with me as well. I think what you then do, and I'm sure you already have, well, clearly you have actually, even just to observe it from afar, is sort of you make it your own, and your persona and kind of way you want to operate in the world is should, I would think, borrow from that, as well as everyone else that's influenced you in some form or fashion over time. You kind of take that, make it your own. But it certainly doesn't hurt, right? It's at least a kind of a starting point for for conversations.
For sure. What markets did you cover when you two worked together?
Yeah, so we started, as I said earlier, kind of the journey. We started in Virginia. The business itself in Virginia had already existed. In fact, kind of fun fact, because there are certainly a number of companies that are like this. I wouldn't think not that many that are around today, but the company had existed for decades before us, well over 50 years. I mean, it traced certain client relationships back to the 1950s or even before that. And we came along in the 80s, if you will. And the period that I'm describing would start in the early 90s, which is sort of here nor there. So we started in Virginia, then expanded into West Virginia. We then merged with a company out of Maryland. I became a partner in that company. Then we expanded into the Carolinas, ultimately sold that business to what is now another national. And I went on to do other things in the industry.
Yeah. When you went to sell the business, is that something that you always had in mind as something you wanted to do, or was it just the circumstance? What was it?
Yeah. So easy question, kind of complicated answer, I think, right?
Yeah.
I would say that it probably was 90% circumstance.
Yeah.
I think one way to think about the broker side of the business, and maybe the industry in general, I don't know, but definitely the broker side is, not much changed for a really long time till it did, and then when it did, it changed very rapidly, right? So again, as I mentioned, our company had clients that had gone back decades, incidentally in food service and retail and deli bakery and convenience store and so forth, right? So some of that kind of also has evolved, but in essence, it didn't really change all that much until it did. So when it did, and the kind of formation of what we think of today as national agencies happened relatively quickly. And we had a client base that was the major clients that were the type that were and are still part of national agencies. So we had I guess you could argue, still had a choice to make at that point, but it felt like kind of a natural evolution. It also, corresponded for us in a lot of ways for him to transition into what ultimately kind of became retirement or the next part of his life, as well as for me, I had done one thing for a really long time. Now, as you know, and really anyone that's kind of been on our side of the business, that to say that you do what you have to do to operate, any business, kind of specifically a food broker business, is so many different things from, kind of finance and operations and strategy and people and kind of building policy and all these types of things, technology. I mean, so there's a lot to it, but I had really just been in that part of the business. So it also was a good opportunity to transition into other things. So when that happened, I moved on to the manufacturer side and worked for Sara Lee, which became Hillshire Bands, which became Tyson, and then moved into other parts of my career past that. So it sort of happened, I think, at a fortuitous time in a way. But I think to your question, was it sort of something we planned? I would say more it's something that evolved out of the industry, out of our personal kind of circumstance, as well as kind of what our desired next stages of our personal and professional lives would be.
Yeah. What do you think from my perspective, when I got into the business in 2015, you had the large national agencies that had started a few years prior to me coming in. But prior to that, what do you think was the impetus for all of this starting? Why did it all kind of happen in the first place?
Meaning the nationalization kind of creation. Wow. Well, I think there's probably a lot of ways to answer that question.
Yeah.
To be honest. And maybe the most obvious one would be that had occurred on the agency side, in retail or in kind of the CPG side of the business earlier. And I think that would be probably the answer most often given. And I think it's valid, right? I mean, because it addresses what I think one of the fundamental challenges of an agency is always, you're always kind of faced with the challenge of scale, right?
Yeah.
Well, how do you sort of balance like having enough clients to pay for the people and the other infrastructure, offices and rents and technology and so forth? But then you have to have enough people and resources in order to attract the appropriate clients. So you sort of go through these cycles of kind of boom and bust in terms of scale. Plus, of course, other parts of the industry, other trading partners, parts of the value chain had also been going through consolidation, right? So certainly on the manufacturer side, just the companies that I mentioned, right? So Sara Lee had, acquired, the different meat companies and, Chef Pierre and so forth over the years, right? I mean, then obviously Tyson, which, acquired Sara Lee and Hillshire, as well as all the companies that became, right? So on the manufacturer side, there had been significant consolidation, which I think so those things could, in a theoretical world, happen independent of each other and not be correlated, right? But I think what happens is the expectations on the client side, therefore, change in terms of how they would overall approach the market. What is their appropriate go-to-market strategy? And how do they deploy their resources and expectations of things like CRM and reporting and so forth, right? Which obviously would change as they would they would grow. So I think those things are both correlated, but also have some causation to them, right? And then obviously on the distributor side, there was massive consolidation, kind of over the decades. That certainly continues. So I think that would be maybe factor number two, right? That drove that. And I think ultimately, when you're in a client agency business, which is fundamentally what this is, right? As a client-based business, you always should and ought to think about and consider what are the client's needs, both today and in the future, right? So I would think ultimately clients in our industry are always kind of searching for what is my ideal go-to-market strategy, and what is the mix of kind of a direct versus an agency sales force. What are the appropriate mix of resources against channels and segments and products and so forth, right? So I would expect that evolution to continue, right? And I think the other thing, Nick, that is maybe less often talked about, quite honestly, is that if you think about, the food dollar or share of stomach or whatever, it's called different things in the industry. I always kind of think about it very simply, like, of course, one of the things we all have in common is we have to eat, and we basically only have two options, which is food at home or food away from home. Again, like, you could quibble about how you define like one versus the other, but I mean, basically it would just be that, right? Show the percentage of dollars, as well as, I would say, the broader kind of cultural movement for decades has been food away from home, right?
Yes.
As a percent of the total. So if you go back to, through my lifetime, it was a relatively small-ish percent, right? So, and likewise cultural. I grew up, you certainly would go out to eat. I mean, there was restaurants and so forth, right? Obviously, but you would go out to eat fewer occasions, and it would be more kind of a special occasion, even fast food and so forth, right? So we think about that now, where that's almost kind of entirely, not that it's entirely flipped, because kind of COVID changed that as well, right? But so the point of that is there was significant growth inherent in the industry for decades, right? I mean, certainly 60s, 70s, 80s, and into 90s. So as that sort of started to level off, to some degree, now obviously it grows with inflation, grows with the growth of population and so forth. But as that broader, kind of the share of food away from home started to get equal to food at home, and now it's, at or just over that, it would be normal for a consolidation to occur across all parts of the value chain, right? So I think it's probably a long answer to your question, but I would expect that evolution would continue as companies on all parts of the industry kind of continue to think about how do I best address the needs of customers and consumers, and what's the appropriate mix of kind of go to market and everything that goes into it.
Yeah, for sure. I want to touch on something that you mentioned, and that was around running a food service brokerage company. That I call it the chicken or the egg. You have to bring in enough revenue and clients to build your business and look attractive enough to larger brands. But it's tough, because you have to bring in the clients, you have to invest in them. If you could think back to maybe a time when you lost a client that was significant to your business, or clients, and what did that look like, and maybe some things that you learned around that experience.
Well, yeah, I've gained plenty and lost plenty. I mean, that's kind of part of the nature of being in this business. By the way, at small, relatively small companies, at relatively medium-sized brokerage companies, and in a very, very large one as well. So I've done it kind of at all three, gained and lost. And, I actually still remember the first one that we lost. So as I mentioned, over the summers, I would work with specific brands as kind of a way to like not have to learn, all these manufacturers. You just kind of work with a few. And one of them, which I'll mention by name only because it's been decades and so many things have changed, but was Yoplait Yogurt, right? So Yoplait Yogurt was I think, so part of General Mills, but was kind of a separate business unit. It was one of the first clients that I took, right? So I would fill up the bag every day and kind of go out, by the way, as a teenager, right? As about 18 or 19. And after that first year, so I was relatively successful, and again, kind of figuring out the proper segments and the proper day parts and kind of honing the pitch and all that kind of type of thing. But at some point, relatively soon thereafter, General Mills decided to pull it into the overall General Mills portfolio and went direct with it. And I can almost remember to this day being pretty devastated by that, right? At that point, more sort of cultural because I identified with it. And, pretty soon thereafter, we picked up, another yogurt client and, sort of figured it out from there, right? So I think, lesson one inherent in that is not to take it personally, not to have it necessarily like reflect one or the other on you as a person or necessarily even you as a company, but it is a good opportunity, that being maybe a relatively benign example, like that's just going to happen. You can't help that. But I've also had it happen, of course, where it was in essence our fault, right? As well as plenty of times where it's not in essence our fault. And I think, sort of getting over that shock value and then sort of figuring out, what's next is a business imperative, but then taking the opportunity to sort of think about, especially both in the cases where it wasn't your fault as well as where it was your fault. And I don't even know that that's really the right terms, but I can tell from that you know what I mean by that, right? Being kind of confident enough, or at least self-aware enough to say, okay, what would I do differently? How would I adjust? What were sort of the failure points in the relationship, or did a competitor kind of think about it differently than I did, and so forth. And I think that's a crucial part of just how you sort of evolve as a small business owner. So
I definitely resonate with that. This business, it really does, it ebbs and flows. You get wins and you get losses, and every time you get a loss, sometimes, does it ever, in my opinion, does it ever get easier? I don't know. It really depends on the client. And you're right, clients leave for all different kinds of reasons. I think in the last few years, we've probably lost a handful of brands just because they get bought and sold and they go somewhere else that's already represented by another broker. Even if you went above and beyond in those situations, sometimes you're powerless, and it's not a good feeling. Or they say, you know what, you're just not very good, and we're going to resign. So it just depends.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue with us that on this side of the business, specific within our industry, that it is among the most, like, that would happen to folks in positions like you are, like I was in the times that I described, more often than other people in other types of jobs, right? Or other types of roles or companies. So that sort of shock value alone, times every time that it happens is something I think you just sort of have to deal with. Again, sort of emotionally and also economically or financially, right? Which is also sort of another thing, because now what, right? So there's different schools of thought on that as well, in terms of how do you, again, going back to my scale question, right? Like, how do you kind of scale up and scale back in a way that's appropriate financially, as well as telegraphing and really messaging confidence to the other clients and to team members and so forth, in a way that helps to kind of keep things going. So I do think over time, like just the natural evolution, I think you get better at that, but I wouldn't expect it necessarily for it to feel any better.
In your experience, when you would lose a piece of business or pieces of or clients, would you try to reduce overhead in those circumstances, or would you say let's just keep what we have and we'll get through this? How did you navigate something like that? And I think that could be pertinent to anybody out there who might lose a big customer or customers that impact your business.
Yeah. Well, I've done both in my career, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that that I necessarily feel like there's one right way to do it versus the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really just depends, on what you think the potential is to backfill that with some other, client or some other piece of revenue that's going to help you out in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on how you would evaluate the risk for other clients, for your overall kind of position in the industry. And I think it's tough. I think when I think about it, for me, it was tough every single time. So I'm not sure I can say that it was ever less so. But I would say probably for me in balance, if I were to think about it, which would be a horrific exercise, really, if I was able to tabulate all the times that happened and what was my response, I probably would find that the scale would weigh more on the side of let's keep what we have resource-wise and try to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
And was that the right call or not? Well, I don't really know, because probably there's people that could be on this call now that would find the scale tipping in the other sense, and maybe they walked away with more money than I did in that sense, right? So I don't know what's right or what's wrong. It just depends on your perspective and how you sort of evaluate those different factors, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned going to Sara Lee, which turned into Hillshire Farms, and then Tyson. And I believe, how did you get back into the brokerage business?
You mean after that? Yeah. So, I've been really fortunate and, certainly worked hard to build skills and
Mm-hmm.
reputation, but most importantly is a network. So I would say that it's not what you asked, but I think it's what you need to hear first and foremost, right? So went onto the manufacturer side almost immediately, actually. Again, Sara Lee, became Hillshire Brands, became Tyson. Been very fortunate. I mean, great companies, great people that I work with. Still very close to the folks that are still there at all those companies, as well as that were kind of alumni with me and went on to other things. And for various reasons, actually, while I was, or at the end of those chain of companies, I got approached and recruited by a friend, a colleague, someone in my network who's still a friend and a mentor. Although the only other person that I'm aware of that's done this, that had gone into the management consulting side from being on the industry, and recruited me to do that. And I did a little bit, maybe a lot bit of a leap of faith. I'm not entirely sure that I knew what that meant, other than it sounded really interesting and exciting. And so I did. So I then spent a few years with two of the largest management consulting firms in Accenture and PwC, and felt just as fortunate and lucky to be part of that. Now, what I did there, which is also kind of interesting, because there's not that many people that know both food service and kind of the CPG side, is that a lot of the work that I did with both of those companies was on the CPG or the retail side, which historically, obviously, the large CPGs within our industry and use a lot of management strategy and IT consulting services, just kind of by the nature of the types of businesses that they are and the types of things that they go through historically. They do in our industry as well. Certainly, that's what I do now, incidentally. but so I learned about kind of the grocery side or the retail side, CPG more broadly, right? So not just food. That's kind of always my interest and passion, but and along the journey of doing that, one of the large at the time, still large national agencies was looking for a new leader and looking for someone that knew the brokerage industry, but that also had experience, professionally outside of just the industry, or just outside of the broker side, but that would have kind of the experience and acumen to know how to run a large organization of any kind, as well as a broker. So they approached me, also another moment that I'll never forget, as you can imagine. And quite honestly, it was just a perfect match in both directions. So that also was, incidentally, because someone in my network who also happened to be in their network knew that the pool of folks that would fit the description that I just made would be relatively small. So approached me, and that's how I got back into it.
What did your day-to-day look like working for a national agency versus when back in earlier in your career working with your dad?
So yeah, great question. I mean, I think it was true during the time at a large national agency that at the core, it was always the same, right?
Okay.
Meaning, I knew that there really wasn't, that all things remaining equal, I could pick up a bag and, fill it in the freezer and go on the street and, be at least in the top 10% of our team or what have you, right?
Yeah.
So maybe not. But and I think that was an important sort of an important point, right? I mean, it grounded me, but also gave a lot of resonance and relatability to both the team as well as on the client side, and then on the customer client side as well as on the customer side, and even in the industry more broadly, right? So, but then at the same time, of course, I had years working for, as I mentioned again, Sara Lee and Tyson Hillshire, certainly the Harvards are among the Ivy League of the best places to learn, operate organizations, act specifically within our industry, as well as doing management consulting for, two great organizations in their own right, not to mention where I worked for really great companies, such as Hershey's, SC Johnson, Clorox, Campbell Soup. I could go on and on, where some of my clients on the consulting side. So that is to say, I always kind of think about your career journey when you look backwards on it or retrospectively. It always kind of plays out like a book or a movie, like it has a very specific narrative to it, right? But forward looking, it's never like that. You sort of, these things come up with some degree of serendipity and sort of being in the right place and building a network and skills. And for me, that in a lot of ways didn't necessarily feel like they had a completely coherent, cohesive narrative to them. When the time came for that to happen, it all fit together in a way. So I'll also tell you that, I've talked to others about this as well, that kind of in your career, in the professional part of your life, that there's always sort of this spectrum between, let's call it on the one hand, where you have no idea what you're doing. Hopefully we don't get in many jobs like that, but it can happen, right?
Yeah, it happens.
All the way to where you completely know what to do, right? And most of the time, I think, if we're being honest, we're maybe somewhere around a 6 or a 7, right? So in that particular case, for me, was the highest degree to which it was closest to this side of the spectrum, or closer to a 9 or a 10, because I had for decades worked in, thought about, got mentored from the greatest people really to ever do it, right? Again, starting with my dad, right? Including, incidentally, your dad and others that worked with him and other great companies that I was fortunate to be able to be a part of, and certainly names that you would know, like Dave Lyons, like Carl Schaffenberger. In fact, your entire, I think, first half dozen or so, maybe dozen guests were all my mentors and heroes, right? So you sort of gain from all that when it was time, that it felt entirely natural, which is not to say in any given day. I could answer your question in that sense, that the types of things that you're faced with, with hundreds and hundreds of people at, 50 plus offices, you're not always entirely prepared for how to deal with that. But I had thought about how to be a professional food service sales agency probably more than I had thought about any other thing in my life, right? So it both felt certainly a newness to it, but very comfortable at the same time.
I like how you described, looking back on your life, that it kind of played out like a book, like a narrative. And when you look back, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, right? I think I would have, this might surprise you a bit, I don't know, but I think I would have moved out of the agency business faster.
Okay.
Not because, incidentally, like, again, great, like highs and lows, we all have highs and lows. But I'm very, even though it's been decades, right? Well, I don't know, it's been decades, but it's been a long time since since that part of my life. And I'm very proud of every company that was part of our evolution to ultimately, selling the business. There were a couple of permutations and different partners and name changes, but it was all kind of in a continuum. Very proud of that. And all the, a lot of the core people that I worked with back then, I still am in touch with, and some of them ended up working with me or for me, in essence, later on in life, which is a kind of a deep experience in its own right. But you have to think about, like, what else do I have to learn, right? What else do I need to be challenged with in order to grow and evolve in my own right? And so I think I would have made that choice probably a handful of so years. Incidentally, I'm not recommending that, right? I think the moral of that story is more like you have to kind of figure that out for your own right.
Yeah.
But other than that, in addition to that, and I don't, in a way, maybe this is what you're asking. It's just, there's no way to, you learn lessons sort of later that could have applied to earlier situations. But I think that's, in the same way that maybe you do bad on a test at school and you figure you better study harder next time, right? Like that's, so it's easy at that point to say, well, I should have studied harder.
I always like the example. I remember when I went, I think when you're 15 or 16, you take the written driving test, right? You're getting tested on what are all the laws of the road and things like that. I'm like, I don't know. I've never driven before. I'll come back to me in 5 years when I've driven around, and I'll tell you what a stop sign does, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I think that's right. Having just taught 2 kids how to drive is, or ride a bike, maybe, as a similar kind of metaphor to it, in a way, which is like the feel of it, right? So it's hard to describe what is the feel of when you should start to lightly apply the brake, right? So the first time my daughter started to do that, right, it's like that. So you're kind of jerky. So you're kind of trying to describe it. It's very difficult to do that, right? So it's the analogy, maybe it's an analogy, not a metaphor, is the way that you sort of build up, how do you interact with clients at different levels, even in different situations. And how do you extract from that lessons in ways that you then modulate how you're reacting to them, and how your body language is, and what do you kind of extract out of that, right? And I think for me, that's been a key learning, because other than the time that I worked for the manufacturers that I've mentioned, I've always been in a client agency type of business. Consulting is the same way. And you think, so the lessons learned there are 100% applicable, even though the thing itself, the service, in this case, professional service, would be very different, or I would say very different. But the lesson around things like, I had a client, I always say clients, by the way, again, people call it different things, or they might use the term interchangeable with customers. I don't like that. But I had a client in my last food broker role that asked me one time, like, you always say client, what do you think the difference is between a client and a customer? And I think they both pay you, so that's certainly similar, right? But a customer buys things from you. A client, you do work on their behalf. And that's fundamentally different, right? How you arrange it, because in a client-based business, the client's mission needs to be your mission, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't disagree with them, or as the kind of the crude saying goes, right? Sometimes you have to tell them their baby's ugly or something like that, right? But you still have to first believe that you are in service to their mission like they are, right? And I think that's different than being in a customer-based business. It's not better or worse. You certainly still build long-term relationships. That's not what I'm implying, but I think analogously, maybe to learning how to apply your brakes at the right moment, or what is really the feel, that kind of ineffable quality of what it feels like to be a proficient driver, and then hopefully over time a good driver, I think would be similar. Certainly in our business, I don't know, maybe all types, but.
Yeah, totally. Well, Taylor, I want to say thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and sharing, your journey in the food service industry. And I know you gave a lot of valuable insights that I know resonate with a lot of people. So I appreciate you being open and vulnerable. And I really enjoyed our conversation. So just truly, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nick. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it myself. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to seeing future episodes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Taylor.